Welcome to the SEI podcast series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. A transcript of today's podcast is posted on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts.
Welcome to the SEI podcast series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. My name is Suzanne Miller, and I'm a principal researcher in the SEI Software Solutions Division. Joining me today to talk about their work on designing and building a software bill of materials framework are my friends Michael Bandor, a senior software engineer, and Dr. Carol Woody, who's a principal researcher over in CERT. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
Yeah, good afternoon.
So let's begin by having you tell our audience a little bit about yourselves. I know you've both been on before, although Mike, it's been quite a while. So let's start with you. Tell us what brought you to the SEI, what you do here, and what's one of the coolest things about your job?
I joined in May 2005, just after wrapping up a almost 23-year military career with the U.S. Air Force as an enlisted programmer. I was aware of the Software Engineering Institute from their process improvement days and was a practitioner, so they were a known factor. The coolest thing to me is the way we work across our various customer bases, the DoD and federal government. We can see trends and see things that might not readily be apparent to other organizations, and we can bring some of that insight into our customer work and say, hey, we're starting to notice this problem's creeping up across several programs that maybe there needs to be a way to address it. So we can, and that we can also, we're early adopters of many things. We were one of the early folks assisting the DoD with agile implementations. Sbombs is going to be another case where we're getting an early foot in the door.
Okay. And Carol, what's something you haven't told us before about you in terms of your career here?
Oh, now that's a tough one because I've done lots of podcasts. I came to the to SEI to actually finish my PhD. I was a consultant for New York City, having a 5.5-hour commute every day, and one does not get things done like in-depth research doing that. I stayed after I finished my PhD because it was such a neat team of people to work with that it's like being one of the superstars with all this in-depth knowledge that you can wander down the halls and connect with. Right now, I'm leading a team of experts. We're focusing on the challenges of cybersecurity early in the life cycle. Because too frequently organizations are kicking the can down the road because they don't know what to do about cybersecurity until it's almost too late. And by that time, they've designed in all kinds of problems, they've built in all kinds of problems, and they're going to have to start over, which nobody's willing to do. So that's why we have a lot of operational problems that we still don't know what to do with.
Mm-hmm.
Mike and I are working with other cybersecurity experts, delving into how we integrate cybersecurity in the supply chain, because that is almost the holy grail at this point.
And we have a podcast on that. So that's one of the things we'll reference in the transcript, because that's a very important piece. So it's good to have you back. Mike, it's good to talk to you on the podcast. It's been a long time, as we were talking about earlier. Today, as Carol mentioned, and Mike, we're here to talk about the idea of a software bill of materials and the framework that you've put together to help people to deal with that. But let's first talk about the threat landscape. You talked in your blog post about a recent report from Security Scorecard that examined more than 230,000 organizations, and they found that the systems of 98% of them, so well over 150,000 of them, have had third-party software components breached within the preceding 2 years. Can you talk a little bit more about this and talk about sort of how the SBOM idea might actually have helped to avoid that all of those breaches, or at least some of those breaches? Carol, I'll start with you.
Yeah, since the Heartland incident, which was 2009, that was one that really hit a broad group of people. A lot of credit and debit card transactions were exposed, and a lot of people got very nervous, but not nervous enough to really address the problems. But they've been growing exponentially since then. And essentially, we're dealing with confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all of this critical data that gets compromised in every one of these activities. Being a real challenge for identity theft, for organizations' structures in terms of financial management, etc. I mean, everything is being exposed these days. A big chunk of this is now coming through the third-party products and services that we've all been adopting very energetically, because it saves us time and money. We can do things quickly. We can implement them very, very quickly. But what you're doing is you're basically adopting risk from other organizations, and you don't really have good insight into what they're doing, what pieces of other products they've actually integrated into what they're selling you, or giving you in the case of open source. And without an SBOM, you really don't have any level of transparency into what's going on, aside from the marketing material and maybe some implementation guides. This is a lot of risk. And to start reducing this risk is really going to be massive. We're hoping that SBOMs will start to be at least a step forward to provide us transparency, but it's no silver bullet. Mike, you've been participating in some of the experiments with that. Maybe you want to add your 2 cents worth.
Sure. Some of the earlier work we did for another customer revolved around software obsolescence. And it was we were doing that, the SBOM information came out, and I started looking at this looks like an SBOM. It's pretty much the same information. And so what we found is a lot of organizations tend to track things on spreadsheets. You go with the lowest common denominator, and that was one of them. And they were trying to track components and relationships on a spreadsheet. Well, you can't see all the interrelationships that way. And so we started using a graph engine, Log4j, ingest the data and start to see where, this has a dependency on this package, but so does this and so does this. And you start seeing things from a broader perspective than just those spreadsheets would show you. And that was some of our early experimentation.
So when we're talking about an SBOM, if I have an app on my phone, let's say I get an app for a debit card, a bank. Right now, I'm guessing I couldn't send an email to the bank and say, "Hey, could I see the SBOM and of all the different applications that your phone app depends on?" I'm kind of assuming we're not there yet in terms of that level of transparency.
We aren't there yet. The concept of an SBOM has been around for a long time. The hardware world's had bill of materials, or HBOMs, for a long time, but SBOMs, there's been attempts over many years, and there's been some reluctance to provide, what's the ingredient list? That's actually one of the things am I revealing something? I don't want to do this. No, you're saying these are the ingredients, but I'm not giving you the recipe, how to assemble those ingredients. Right. That's a big difference.
But some people don't even want to let you have the ingredients because they fear that you're a good enough chef that you can actually
to replicate it or reverse engineer it, yes.
Right? So that's where some of that fear comes from. So there is this balance between transparency and privacy in terms of the privacy of the people that are building the application and intellectual property as well. Go ahead, Carol.
The other piece is that if you know you're using products that are of sketchy origin, by providing this SBOM, you're essentially providing information to those that might want to do something to your product that you may not want have added. So it's somewhat of a listing of potential vulnerabilities if they can identify them in the components that you're using. So all of those become very much concern points for vendors in terms of putting these out in the open. I think we're not looking at them as something that somebody's going to be able to just call up and arbitrarily get their hands on. There'll be a little bit more control on it than that.
And when I look at the commercial, there's that side, and then we then also have the DoD, and we have the Executive Order 14028 from 2021, and that basically says the U.S. government has to enhance supply chain software security and integrity, and that's one of the places that you're looking at SBOMs really being a part of that understanding. Is that correct?
It is, but the SBOM by itself is not going to really do anything more than provide you with a picture of what you've got and maybe some insight into where you might be vulnerable. But certainly it's going to take a lot more integration with other information to actually make use of it. We've been exploring a lot of the potential for how we can actually leverage an SBOM. Face it, putting all those, you have a lot of third-party software. You're going to have a lot of data around SBOM. If you're going to the expense and energy of collecting it, putting it together, we need to make more use of it than just having a nice package on the shelf that checks the box and says, yes, I did compliance. So we have been exploring, how do you get value out of this? How can you really make it work for your organization? Some of that comes with what Mike was talking about with the visualization. I think a lot of it also comes with just increasing your familiarity with what you really have as far as risk. You should be able to start to assemble a realistic perspective on what you have in-house and potentially how you need to improve your protections. Mike, did you want to talk a little bit more maybe about the graphics that we were doing in terms of the use cases?
Yes. We started, on behalf of one of our customers, we started looking at some use cases for SBOMs and what an SBOM has in it that can answer that use case on its own versus I need additional information beyond the SBOM. For example, an SBOM will tell you I have component X and it depends on component Y. It won't necessarily tell you where in the software architecture it is. That information is typically not part of an SBOM. It won't tell you what hardware element or segment it's in. So you're going to need additional information from there. So an SBOM plus other information gives you a lot better sight picture on what's going on with your system, what the risks are. Because it could turn out quite easily that arbitrary example, Log4j, that you've got more than one instance in your system that multiple components depend on that you may not necessarily be aware of until you start looking at those dependencies. And this also includes your tool chain that develop those products.
Okay. So we've been talking around SBOM and sort of without actually defining what's in and out of the SBOM. So before we go further, why don't we go ahead and, for those that aren't familiar with this concept already, what would they expect to see in an SBOM? And as you were saying, Mike, what would they expect not to see?
So there is, in the guidance that came out, there's a minimum essential elements document. What that laid out was we expect to see, okay, the author, who provided this information, where's the component from, the name of the component, the version number, if there's some sort of unique identifier, what is the date of the SBOM, how current is it, and does it contain or depend upon other components? And that's where you get your primary, your secondary, your tertiary, all those layers down till, oh, I don't depend on anything else, so I know that line stops as far as my dependencies is concerned. That's the minimum set. Most of the SBOM tools, like right now, the guidance that came out from that minimum essential elements talk about either using the SPDX format, CycloneDX, or the software identification. And each of those standards have additional elements that a tool may support. So there's additional information, but at a minimum, there's those elements that they want you to have to complete compliance with the executive order. Now, where things get interesting, there was a recent report that came out earlier this year. The company did. They looked at 3,000 SBOMs. I'm guessing based on the source, it was mostly open source. Only 1% of them were compliant with the minimum essential elements. The rest of them had problems, incomplete information, versioning information, other things like that they weren't fully compliant. So there's still some quality issues that need to be addressed that hopefully it will slowly start to converge to where there's a better set of expectations.
And have you guys done a survey of like how many, I just thought about this, how many systems are out there that you would want to have SBOMs for? It's got to be in the hundreds of thousands at this point. I mean,
I would guess BNX, if you've got the primary product and then any components it uses, and then those components have components they use. So this becomes a problem that expands exponentially rather quickly. So
right.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about with a lot of data, because you're going to have to go many, many levels deep to really know what you've got in your products. The framework we built, though, really is focused on how to use this stuff, because an organization is going to have some really new practices and effective processes in place to really make use of this. They've got to have a whole series of processes integrated into their bills that feeds the software bill of materials to appropriately insert their information. They're going to have some way through their acquisition of acquiring the SBOMs for each one of the products, libraries, services, you name it. I mean, it just goes on and on and on because we do a tremendous amount of reuse across the technology base. And then there has to be a way of vetting them in terms of quality, which gets to the issue Mike was talking about. Garbage in, garbage out is one of the standard statements, and this will just feed that engine if we're not careful. And then if we're going to effectively use it, we were exploring several use cases. If you need to find if a new vulnerability comes out and you need to determine, do I have this? You've got to go beyond just accessing the SBOM. That'll tell you, yeah, there is the piece is there somewhere in your ingredients list that is spread all over your organization. Good luck in finding it. So it's got to integrate with other areas in your environment, your configuration management, all of the controls that you have in your operational environment. You're going to want a way to flag this stuff automatically. I mean, there are new vulnerabilities discovered minute by minute. That volume is huge. You're not going to want to look these up one at a time. This is going to have to be something that also has automation related to it. So we're really talking about an ecosystem here. Our framework is really just scratching the surface. It's saying we know we need changes in all of these different areas. So this is where you need to at least think about, get started on. Some of them you'll start manually, but you also need to be thinking about automating them.
Yeah, one of the approaches we did when we did the framework wasn't that how do you generate an SBOM? We went from the standpoint as you have an SBOM, now what do I do with it? What should I be doing with it? How should I handle it? Should it be a configuration item? Does it affect my acquisition? Does it affect engineering? Does it affect test and eval? Things like that. So that's kind of a unique approach we've seen in the SBOM literature that's out there right now. No one seems to be addressing the now what questions.
And you're making me think about sort of one of the connections that you sort of briefly mentioned, but I want to come back to it. There's the configuration piece, but then there's also the architectural view of the system, which is, I'm going back to what you said earlier, Carol, about we need to get security in earlier. This is one of the places where if the architecture is identifying the elements, and then that goes into an SBOM, you've got a connection back to that. If we decide that we're not going to use this component, here are the effects that has, because there's all these other places that use it or not. And so it seems like there's a strong connection between having an SBOM and having a well-defined software architecture that you can understand how the pieces in the SBOM essentially are part of the recipe, if you will, for the whole
Right.
thing.
And you're going to have more than one SBOM. You're going to have multiple SBOMs because your product coming through your developmental pipeline is going to have one or more SBOMs, depending on how many things are coming through there. SBOMs of the components that make up your pipeline, your tools, because some of those vulnerabilities may not only be in your product, they may be in your tool chain. And then you've got tools that may support the end product out in the field that didn't necessarily come through your pipeline that could also still have those vulnerabilities. So we're talking multiple SBOMs. That's why one of the things the tools need to do is be able to ingest SBOMs besides generate them. That I got an SBOM for Adobe Reader or some other package. How many programs have we seen where they're using multiple versions of the same component? You're going to have SBOMs for each of those. This is not the current version. This was like Windows 8. I need an SBOM for that. So.
Yeah, and you're going to have to maintain that information about those multiple versions as you roll upgrades through your organization. All of these are issues that are coming to the forefront. Having an SBOM is nice, but actually making use of it is the only thing that makes sense.
Right.
Because this will help us at least better understand what we've got in the supply chain. And also, as we can start to characterize these, we should be able to start to quantify the risks somehow. That's more research.
More research. You always have a research agenda, Carol. You are never bored.
It's a target-rich environment. What can I say?
There you go. So another target I'm thinking about are legacy systems, and I know that many of our government customers don't often always have the option of upgrading. They have to use systems that have been in play for a long time that were way before anybody thought about SBOMs. What are some of the? Is it better just to leave it alone, or are legacy systems something you really want to pay attention to and create SBOMs for if you can?
Legacy systems do present a challenge. If you've got access to the source code, you could use an SBOM tool to try to generate an SBOM to the best of your ability, at least to that first level of components.
Right.
From there, it's going to take some analysis. If you don't have access to the code, you may have to derive one through software composition analysis, scans of some type, trying to figure out, okay, what's in this recipe? What do I need to be worried about? Because it all comes down to managing the risk. That when they talk about on the executive order and then the subsequent minimum elements, talk about what unknowns do I have? How do I manage those?
Well, too, you really need to prioritize the legacy products. Some of them have more exposure than others.
Right.
And so again, it looks at how are you organized in terms of technology protection? If these are standalone tools that aren't widely connected, then your risk is fairly minimal. Maybe you put that on the lower priority. But if this is something that's a key component to your product and it's widely used, you really need to analyze it and understand what you've got. Because we know supply chain risk is growing.
That's I love talking to you all, and then I hate it because then I can't sleep for 2 nights afterwards.
Exactly. You are not the first person who made that statement.
Welcome to our world. Yes.
Welcome. I don't know how you sleep. I swear I don't know how you sleep. All right. So let's switch gears a little bit. So tech manufacturers, many of them are taking this seriously, but what are the biggest mistakes that they can make? What cautions would you give to tech manufacturers that do want to take this seriously and do want to create software bills and materials for their products?
So not necessarily mistakes, more challenges. As I said earlier, the quality. is the data complete? That's a big one. Do I have all the fields filled out so the end user, whether it's going into another product or IM, then probably knows what's in there? Consistency in like the version schemes. You name the versioning scheme, it's probably in an SBOM, but taking that version information, and because right now the emphasis seems to be on vulnerabilities, and tying it to a vulnerability database, if I can't make that match, there's a lot more manual analysis that has to be done.
Mm.
Again, drilling down in those dependencies beyond the primary component. Can I figure out what's out there? So that's one of the challenge. There's discussions back and forth I've seen in some of the articles about how do we make the SBOM data available. One method potentially could be, okay, most of these developers or vendors have a support page. You can make it publicly available that way. Others may be a little bit more cautious about what we don't really want to tell you all the components. There's some sensitivities for whatever reason. And in that case, you may have to do get a direct submission from that vendor to whoever's developing your system, or to you as the acquiring organization. So there are those challenges. So and again, there's always discussions about intellectual property. Again, there are ways to do it without, you're showing the ingredients, you're not showing the recipe.
Right.
Well, also, I think it's a case where they need to crawl before they run. Start experimenting with a few of your products, work with some of your close customers so that you can start to create a smooth way before you roll something out and then have everybody screaming at you because it's missing this, that, and the other, or they can't get to it the way they need to. There are so many variables right now, and we don't have what I would consider to be well-structured processes ready for this yet. And the tooling is just getting started. It's still very much on the hands-on stage. It's what I like to think of, where you have to babysit it a lot to get out of it what you need. And we're still discovering, what do we ultimately need? You don't want to get halfway through a major development and realize, oh my God, if we'd done 3 or 4 other things at the beginning, it would be so much smoother. Let's work our way into this.
Okay.
But the value, I think, is definitely to be had.
So you're actually kind of moving into the transition aspects of this. So what kind of piloting have you done for this framework? And can you share any of the results or any of the in-progress things that you're seeing that have informed how you're thinking about the SBOM problem?
I think from piloting, it would be more expert eyes on the problem right now. We're really trying to assemble the best minds to figure out for the framework. Now, Mike, you've been exploring a few other avenues a little more closely.
Right. Like I said, we with our approach, that what do we do with this now that we have it, that has been where we're trying to look for piloting opportunities. So we're always interested in hearing from organizations that are interested in applying it, and getting feedback. Is it working? Is it not working? Do we need to tweak something that was not addressed? There is some growing interest from some of our DoD and federal customers. A lot of it's through word of mouth, and plus seeing it out on our website. And I know I was contacted from at least one commercial company that was interested in, okay, how do we apply this? This might make sense to us as a company that provides software to the federal government.
Right. Yeah, that's going to be interesting, because I'm also thinking about even things like small businesses that provide support software and other support to federal government. This could be very impactful if you are a small business and you're trying to do this, as opposed to one of the larger companies that have a lot of resources. So I can see a lot of implications for this as this becomes a more popular way of communicating about what are our ingredients in our recipe.
Well, I think small businesses are going to have an easier time because they have fewer ingrained processes. They've got a little more flexibility than major organizations, which, especially if you have a lot of divisions and you want to have things done consistently, structuring that the right way to roll out at large is challenging.
Fair enough.
I mean,
Fair enough.
there are commercial tools, there's open source tools out there. So pick what makes sense for you, what works. There are other ways to get involved with this. The Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA website, has a lot of good SBOM information. They also have several working groups that the public or organizations can attend. I know I sit on one of them just to see what's going on with the adoption and the transition. The National Telecommunications and Information Administration website also has a lot of good software bill of materials information on it. They were the ones that originally hosted the original minimum essential elements that came out of the Department of Commerce.
Oh, okay.
That website also has an interesting SBOM myths, and it's one of them that Carol actually touched upon earlier about, well, if I give you an SBOM, it'll show you what's in my recipe. I can attack this. And that, while that is a risk, that is the first myth that attackers aren't using SBOMs to get into your system. They have other ways they're finding out from 0 days. SBOM is not.
Yeah, that's true.
So there are other things to worry about.
So any other guidance that you would want to give government agencies, typically who are acquiring, that they're starting out in this, what should they be asking for? What should they be looking for from their vendors?
They're going to have to ask for SBOMs in the contract if they want them. That's not something they can assume that a vendor is just going to hand them. We've already seen several agencies running into that problem of, oh, this is a new mandate. Let me just have the SBOM. And the vendors are saying, it's extra work for us. You're going to have to pay for that. So I think that's one of the starting areas.
Yeah, it's not a give me the SBOM, check the box, I got an SBOM. And again, you need to do the analysis. What are the impacts of it? It's a configuration information, and it needs to be treated as such, just as any other configuration item in your system. And take the time to do the due diligence for the analysis. That is the big payoff.
But the other thing that I heard you say is don't assume that just because it's standard, if you will, configuration information, that it's going to be provided. You must ask for it explicitly at this point in the way vendors are treating that kind of information.
A lot of times the way these executive orders and other policy changes that come down from where the federal government, those aren't reflected in the contract. So it takes a contract change from the acquiring organization to say, hey, we need to start doing this. Let's figure out how much it's going to cost, when we can do it, when we're going to start expecting the outputs from it. So it's not a matter of get a tool and run it and send it to us when you got it.
Right.
Also figuring out the frequencies of the deliveries. Right now, a lot of the wording says major release, or when the software is delivered. Well, define major release, define delivered. If you're using an agile methodology, every build should have an SBOM coming out of it. So there's some language lawyer wording that they need to be careful of to make sure everyone's interpreting what those terms actually mean when it comes time to implement the contract.
Okay, so this plays into we don't call it a series, but basically we've been essentially doing a series of podcasts on supply chain security over time. And Carol, that's a passion of yours, I know.
Right.
Beyond the SBOMs, what's next for you in that realm of supply chain security?
Well, we're really trying to figure out how do you characterize what the supply chain risk is. How do you think about it? If I have a supply chain, how do I characterize that risk? Right now, we're just trying to figure out qualitatively, but ultimately there should be a way that we can measure that risk. Can we measure? We don't want to count vulnerabilities. That doesn't really tell you anything, because in order to be useful, the measurements have to give you a way to figure out how to respond in terms of what's too risky. How do I know when it's reasonable, when it's not going to create additional problems? All of those are questions we really don't know how to answer yet. We don't know how to evaluate it. We can look at it within a single product for a supply chain and look at the product itself, but all of the pieces that go into it are now just becoming part of the attack surface. So we have this expanded window that we need to add to our risk picture. And that's what we're working on right now. I'm trying to characterize it and then figure out what do we do with it.
Okay. And Mike, what's next for you? Are you going to continue with the SBOM stuff for a while, or do you have something else you're
actually. I still have a keen interest in the potential of graphing out the SBOMs when combined with architectural data and the vulnerability data in particular, to show how you can take those different sets of data, put them together, and you have this, light bulb moment. I've got a problem, and here's where it's at. One aspect I am currently working on for another customer is looking at how SBOMs might effectively be used to support test and evaluation activities. We're looking at various things there. Yeah, it's a very specific area that we're looking at some potential use cases there. And like I said, we also had an opportunity recently to provide some comments back for the proposed federal acquisition rate wording.
We've probably had enough information to be dangerous right now, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's the thing. All right. Well, thanks again for keeping me awake tonight. I always have that to look forward to.
Providing tonight's insomnia here.
There you go. But I do want to thank you for talking with us today. I think that this is one of the many topics in cybersecurity that are starting to get attention and that need a lot more attention. So we do appreciate you taking the time to help us understand it. As always, we're going to include links in the transcripts to resources, websites that were mentioned during this podcast. And finally, a reminder to our audience that our podcasts are available pretty much every place you download podcasts, as well as our own SEI YouTube channel. And if you like what you see in here today, you're always welcome to give us a thumbs up. We always appreciate that. I want to thank Carol and Mike again for joining me today. And I want to thank all of our viewers for paying attention to this important information.
Thanks for joining us. This episode is available where you download podcasts, including SoundCloud, TuneIn Radio, and Apple Podcasts. It is also available on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts and the SEI's YouTube channel. This copyrighted work is made available through the Software Engineering Institute, a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. For more information about the SEI and this work, please visit www.sei.cmu.edu. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at info@sei.cmu.edu. Thank you.